Yes, now let's talk about Heartbound. This game began with a Kickstarter in 2017, raising almost $20,000 and hit early access in December 2018. Now, more than 8 years later, it's still unfinished, with updates slowing down and not much new content to show for all that time. I'm not here to talk about code or developer drama. I'm just a gamer who spent roughly 3 hours seeing everything Heartbound currently offers. Heartbound's core gameplay loop is about as basic as it gets. You move from one area to another slowly and interact with NPCs along the way. There's no run button, so every environment feels bigger than it really is. This isn't just a minor annoyance. The slow pace stretches out even in the simplest tasks, making the game feel longer than it actually is. For example, in the forest section, you're required to walk the same paths twice because the game phases routes in and out, which means you're backtracking over familiar ground with no way to speed things up. It's a design choice that, after 8 years of development, just feels outdated. Most of your time is spent talking to NPCs who mostly offer cryptic comments about anxiety or dissatisfaction, but these conversations rarely go anywhere. The dialogue often hints at deeper themes, but never delivers concrete development or meaningful choices. You'll find yourself clicking through text boxes that don't build toward anything significant, just vague lines that start to blend together. One character, for instance, only talks about hating their job, a detail that never leads to a payoff or further insight. When you're not walking or talking, you'll run into a handful of puzzles. Calling them puzzles might be generous. They're more like chores. If you need a key, it's exactly where you would expect. If you have to find an item, it's right in front of you. There's no challenge or sense of discovery, just basic fetch tasks that the game practically solves for you. The puzzles are so simple you can't really fail, so they don't break up the repetition or offer any real satisfaction. There are also a couple of mini games, but these don't add much variety. One asks you to click a button in time with some music, and another has you sorting objects into piles. These moments feel more like busy work than actual gameplay. After all this, you're left with just two unique combat encounters that together last about 3.5 minutes, which is a tiny fraction compared to the hours spent walking and talking. Even if you enjoy narrative-driven games, the slow pacing and lack of gameplay variety make Heartbound feel tedious. The game leans heavily on its story to keep you interested, but when you spend most of your time moving slowly and going through shallow dialogue, it's hard for the narrative to carry the experience. That's where Heartbound's next big issue comes in. When it comes to story, Heartbound aims for something deep about mental health and relationships, but it ends up feeling more like personal venting than a narrative you can actually get invested in. The main character, Lore, loses his dog Baron within the first 10 minutes, and that's supposed to be the emotional hook. The problem is you barely spend any time with Baron before he's taken away. There's no real build-up or meaningful interaction, so when the game expects you to care about Lore's quest to save Baron, it just doesn't land. This lack of relationship building is a big reason why the story's central premise falls flat. The dialogue throughout the game doesn't help much either. Most characters speak in vague, repetitive lines that try to sound profound but end up feeling empty. Sometimes characters will just vent about their problems in a way that feels more like the developer airing personal frustrations rather than advancing the plot. The conversations rarely move the story forward or reveal anything meaningful about the characters, so it's hard to get invested in what's happening. The pacing is another issue. The narrative jumps between scenes with little setup, so big moments don't have any weight. You'll go from walking through a forest to a surreal dream sequence without warning or explanation. Flashbacks pop up out of nowhere and don't connect to anything you've seen before, which just adds to the confusion. The story leans heavily on unexplained events, but instead of creating intrigue, it just leaves you feeling lost. Even when the game tries to tackle heavier themes like anxiety or depression, it does so without much depth, so the emotional impact just isn't there. It's also worth mentioning how little story content there actually is. After all these years, the early access build only covers one full chapter and a good portion of Act 2. That's not much to show after such a long development time, and it means the narrative feels thin and incomplete. Even the multiple possible endings can't make up for the lack of meaningful choices or well-developed characters. The result is a story that feels more like a collection of personal thoughts than a game you can actually connect with. With the story falling short, you'd hope the gameplay mechanics would pick up the slack, but that's not the case either. Combat in Heartbound is sparse and basic. There are exactly two combat encounters in the current build, one unique and one repeat, and both use a minigame format that feels stiff. You wait for enemies to telegraph their attacks, then respond with timed button presses. There's no strategy, no leveling, and no variety. The first fight against a weird entity has some novelty, with timing-based inputs that are a little fun at first, but the enjoyment fades fast once you realize the second fight is just a repeat of the same mechanics. It's not enough to make an impression, and the repetition makes it even feel less significant. The minigame style of combat could have been a bright spot, but it's let down by a lack of ideas. The enemy's health bar drops at a crawl, so even these short fights start to feel like a chore. You're not learning new patterns or adapting to new threats. Just repeat the same simple actions until it's over. Puzzles are just as underwhelming. There are 5 puzzles in total, and most of them involve pushing blocks or flipping switches, with each one having only a single, obvious solution and no real way to fail. For example, a block pushing puzzle only lets you move pieces in one direction, so you can't make a mistake. Another puzzle in the cafeteria section has you pressing through orders, but it's more tedious than engaging. These so-called challenges rarely require any thought, and the repetition exacerbates it. Granted, there is one section in the game where you are required to decipher a 4-digit code in an office to unlock a door to progress. That one took some time to figure out that I wish I could say the same for the rest. Minigames pop up here and there, but they don't break up the monotony. Whether it's a rhythm section with an overly generous timing window or sorting objects into piles, these segments feel like filler. The lack of variety across combat, puzzles, and minigames means there's nothing to look forward to after the first hour. With so little substance in the core gameplay, it's hard not to focus on what actually stands out. One thing that I did like is Heartbound's pixel art and soundtrack are its most polished features. The pixel art is clean, with each character having a unique look, and the environments feeling lively despite their simplicity. The title screen especially gets a lot of praise for its moody style. It sets a strong first impression that the rest of the game doesn't quite live up to. Each area uses a distinct color palette, like the muted blues in the forest or the warmer tones inside buildings, and the animation work is smooth whether you're walking around or watching a fight play out. It's clear that a lot of care went into the visual design, and that attention to detail is hard to miss. The soundtrack is just as solid. Tracks shift smoothly between calm, atmospheric background pieces and more intense music for the rare combat moments. The way the soundtrack fits each scene helps cover up some of the game's weaker moments. Even the smaller ambient sounds, like wind in the forest or the hum of machinery in certain rooms, add something extra that the gameplay itself doesn't provide. Still, good art and music can only do so much. You can have a game that looks and sounds great, but if the gameplay is thin, those strengths can't hide the problems underneath. The visuals and audio are impressive, but they don't make the slow pacing or repetitive tasks any more interesting. You end up walking through well-designed areas, listening to a great track, but then hitting another basic puzzle or shallow dialogue exchange. The contrast is hard to ignore. So while Heartbound's presentation might catch your attention at first, it doesn't take long for the shine to wear off once you get into the actual game. Even with the best visuals and music, you're left with an experience that doesn't give you much reason to stick around. Looking at Heartbound overall, it's hard to recommend picking it up right now. The game has been in early access since 2018, and after all that time, there's only one finished chapter and part of a second. You get just 2 combat encounters that can be completed in minutes and only 5 basic puzzles. The slow pace of updates and the limited content make it feel like progress has stalled. Despite its accessible price tag, there are many other games within that range that deserve your hard-earned money. In the meantime, let me know in the comments which early access games you've played that actually delivered a meaningful experience. I'm always looking for solid recommendations. And if you're wondering why the price of video games are now more expensive than ever, check out my previous video on how we have arrived at that point.